Hi, Nicole.
Hey, Doug. Hey, Omac.
Hello.
Hey, Max.
Oh, you're muted, Nicole, if you were saying anything.
Oh, no, I was singing to my daughter.
Doug, are you there?
I am, yes.
Oh, hold on. Now it's an audio issue on my side. All right, let's try that.
Check 1, 2.
Perfect. Thank you.
Excellent.
Well, as always, I don't have anything prepared. Any questions from either of you?
Honestly, my plan was just to sit in and watch as you went over any SQL questions that people had.
Nicole, do you have any questions? Anything come up during SQL Bolt that you have questions about?
You will be very sad. It's like I spent my weekend reviewing JavaScript, which I feel like I 100% know now.
Okay.
So I was reviewing this morning a little more React. So I have not touched SQL, but I do plan on finish that like tonight. So I thought I would, sit in and watch everybody do some SQL just to make sure. But
Cool.
Yeah.
How are we feeling about Khan Academy and SQL Bolt? Are they helpful? Do we feel like we need more resources, different resources? How are we feeling in general?
I felt like that. I mean, they're good exercises to go over the different commands. Like I don't feel like I know them, like I don't like I feel like I could sit down and write some JavaScript or sit down and write some HTML without reference. I mean, I'd probably have to look stuff up if along the way if I needed to do anything outside what I do know. But like with SQL, at this point, I just have to go and look it up every single time. Like none of that is so I guess more exercises would be useful.
Okay. Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit next week too, or this upcoming week, I should say, because a lot of the SQL that we learned is kind of like SQL in a vacuum, right? It's like, okay, I understand select and update and create table and that kind of stuff, but now how do we use it, right? And that's what we're going to get into next week, is a little bit on the database design of understanding what an entity relationship diagram is and how we should architect out our database design. And then we'll actually dive into setting up a database next week and getting connected to it, using that on our computer, and then also connecting it eventually into Node and how we can use it programmatically as well. So we're headed into that. There will be a little bit more exercises coming our way. I also know Free Code Camp does have a SQL section. That was kind of under development the last time that I looked at it. But I do believe that is a little bit more fleshed out now. So if you are looking for just more exercises to practice kind of the stuff we've already covered, looking at Free Code Camp is definitely worth it as well.
All right, yeah, I'll definitely check that out.
That's going to be under the relational database beta certificate. And they're using all Postgres there, but they've got a couple projects in there for practicing working with different data sets and using SQL.
Okay, yep, I found it. So this might be what we're going to cover next week, but one question I had about SQL was like, where do you use it? I mean, like where are you when you're writing SQL? Do you like what?
Yeah.
Like, and where do you put the files? What are the files? Are they .SQL files? Or?
They are. Yep. And so SQL is another scripting language, right? So that you can write 5 SQL commands in a row, and as long as they've got semicolons between them, you can save that, and a .SQL file is another text file, just like .js or .html is. And then in order to execute those commands, you can either execute those commands in the terminal. Excuse me. Either in the terminal, or there are programs kind of like Postman, where you can write your SQL commands and see the results of those queries. So we're going to be using a program next week called Beekeeper Studio, and that's going to allow us to connect into our SQL database and execute the commands and see the output of them. However, that is kind of that is just another tool that we can use to kind of execute our commands and visualize them. Where we are going to be writing most of our commands is directly in our node code. So we'll actually be using just regular strings and using a special package from NPM to connect into our database. And then the results of our query will be able to access as just regular JavaScript objects. So next week, we're going to get into using a tool called an object relational mapper, or an ORM, which is literally that whole tool's job is to take the results of our SQL queries and to map them into JavaScript objects and vice versa. But we're going to get started. That's kind of leveling up our node skills and using a tool like SQLize. So we are going to work our way up to that by starting to just execute our queries in regular JavaScript and Node, being able to get those results back, and then leveling our way up to SQLize. So a very long answer to your question is we can use SQL in a lot of different places. And we can use tools like Beekeeper Studio or the terminal to execute our SQL commands directly. But where we will be learning how to use them is in our node code, so that we can actually take input from an API call, which will be coming from our React code, store that in the database, and then return the results of it as well.
Okay, I was going to ask about that as like a in practice example, like in our capstone projects, if we have like a create, sign in or create an account, we put a username and password, and then that has to call, I assume that would run some SQL that would write that into the database.
Correct.
So
Yes.
that'll be, the React will be calling a node script or React will be calling the API.
React will be calling the API via a fetch command that will be executing an endpoint in our node script that is basically just a function.
Okay, and that
Right.
will execute the SQL.
And that will execute the SQL and return some data, which will come back to the request made in fetch and be in the response of that fetch request. Yep, it kind of goes full circle, but it goes JavaScript, whether that's React or vanilla JavaScript, making a fetch request, the fetch request going to our node endpoint, which is just a function of code that is going to execute some SQL. That SQL is going to return some results. Those results will go back into the response of the node endpoint. That node endpoint will respond to the fetch request in our front-end JavaScript, and then our front-end JavaScript will parse out that response and either set it into state if it's React code, or display it in the interface with inner HTML or something like that.
So I need to go watch something on Node like right now. That's what that sounds like.
No. So we haven't touched Node at all in class.
Okay.
That is what's coming up. Do not panic on that yet. So that is kind of like we just kind of scratched the surface on SQL commands. Next week, we're going to start getting into using our SQL commands to do database design and make sure that our data is structured properly in the database. And then we do intro to Node, and then we go into kind of full stack everything, right? And so those last couple weeks of the curriculum are my favorite because it's like tying everything together, right? It's like doing all of our intro to HTML that we started the course with. It's doing all of the JavaScript that we learned both in the front end and the back end. It's doing all of the SQL stuff that we learned and all of the React stuff we learned with state. It's building our own API and it's pulling everything together. So it really kind of like accelerates all at the end. And it's like, hey, all of these things that we've been teaching you, you can use them all together. But we aren't there yet, right? The way we teach SQL is we say, here are the SQL commands, which we did last week. This week, we're going to talk about how do we design our data so it's storing properly in SQL, right? How does this relational database work? Okay, we learned about inner joins. How should we structure our data so we can actually do those joins? Then we move into Node and we say, hey, this is how we can make our endpoints. Here's how we can run a server. And then we tie it all together and we say, here's how we're going to build our API. So that's kind of what's coming up.
Perfect. I'm excited.
I'm excited and a little scared.
Well, when I get excited, it probably should invoke a little bit of fear in the students as well. So.
No, I'm more excited because a lot of people around me were like, "Are you sure you think you're gonna be able to do this?" I'm like, if I say I'm gonna do something, I'm gonna do it. So.
And important to remember here that all of this is exposure, right? Like you're not coming out of here as a senior dev. No boot camp that is promising that is able to actually fulfill on that, right? So the goal here is like, hey, we're going to get you out of here. You're going to be exposed to the concepts and you're going to be able to build a capstone that is full stack, right? From there, it is just a matter of practice, right? And that's what going out and working as a junior dev is going to be like, is you're going to be like, I don't remember the SQL commands, but I remember that it's something to do with select. And I'm going to know enough to Google W3 School SQL select get data, right? And read that documentation and actually be able to understand it. Think to the beginning of the boot camp, think back to reading a W3 page, you probably wouldn't have been able to actually understand the information that was on that page, right? You wouldn't have even known to Google what SQL was, right? And so that's where we're trying to get you at professionally, is to the point where you can read that documentation, because any technical test that you're in, any whiteboarding thing, they should be encouraging you to use that and to use documentation, right? Because that is, I mean, even senior devs, I still look up the documentation when I'm going through these things. So it is not meant to be hey, you're going to master this at the end, but it is just to say, hey, I've been exposed to these concepts. I understand what Node is. I understand how this data should be flowing. And now when you ask me to build something, I can actually say, oh, I'm going to need a Node project and a database server and a React project and all of that. And I'm going to be able to know enough of how to get all of that started, or know enough to be able to read this code and figure out where it's going wrong.
Absolutely, absolutely. Perfect. Dang, I was hoping somebody else would come.
Yeah, with
Cold.
some review questions.
Yeah.
So talking about starting out as a junior developer somewhere, how much, and the fact that we would be going into a job with, as you said, exposure to these concepts, not necessarily, extensive experience with them, like what kind of stuff do you start out with that, I guess, what kind of stuff do you start out doing so that you're not just at every turn saying, hey, what do I do? How do I do this? Like what kind of tasks do junior developers, what are they given?
As usual, that's a pretty loaded question from you, Doug. It's obviously going to be very different at every employer. So some
course.
employers will say, hey, because you're a junior dev, we're going to start you out with front end work only. So we're going to give you a mock-up that our designer has created in some design tool like Sketch or Figma or Photoshop. And we want you to go implement this design. And so you're gonna get out and you're gonna start doing your HTML. And as a junior dev, you're very rarely expected to pick tools from scratch. So your company is gonna say, hey, we use Bootstrap in every website, or hey, here's this existing code base. We just need you to add a new page. But your job would be to do what we call pixel perfect mockup implementation. Right. So, hey, I was given this mock-up in mobile, tablet, and desktop screens, and I'm going to get my code to look just like that mock-up. And there may be some HTML, oh, I'm sorry, there may be some JavaScript, but it's going to be pretty basic JavaScript, right? Of, hey, I need to make a call to this API. The API already exists. I'm already given the documentation. All I need to do is make the call and then have that data show up on the page. That is some junior developer job roles. That is how companies handle it, is they say, start out with front end and we can work your way up to back end and database stuff. In other roles, it would be a little bit more full stack, right? Of, hey, we're going to give you a task. And when we give you that task, we want you to wrap your head around it first and foremost. We need you to understand what we're asking you to do before you try and go do it. So go find the snippet of the code that already exists where you're going to be adding the feature into. Make sure you understand from a user perspective how this feature is supposed to work. Make sure that you understand, hey, if I need something to change in the database, that I have database access or can find the code where the database is kind of already up and running. Let me make sure that I understand I've got a test environment on my computer, right? So that I've got a copy of the code that's installed and running on my computer that I can play around with. And if all goes wrong, I can always just reset my way back to the initial copy of the code and everything will be okay. So that's kind of the first step as a junior dev of, let me understand what they're asking me to do as if I'm a user using the software. Then you kind of go back to your senior dev or your project manager and you say, hey, I think I understand this. You gave me this task. I spent 2 or 3 hours reading through all of the code. Here's where I'm thinking to get started. Here's how long I think it's going to take me to do all of this. And here are my potential roadblocks, right? Oh, I may need to do something in the database, but I don't have access to create new tables in the database. So is there someone on the team? Is there a database engineer? Is there another senior developer who is going to be able to help me with that? From there, you kind of move on to the next step, which is, let me go try and do it. And any good company hiring junior devs are going to have senior devs to be your mentor. Sometimes that's kind of just a team and you're going to throw your question out to the team and whoever last worked on that code is going to be your mentor. Sometimes you're in a small enough company where they say, hey, Max is going to be your senior mentor, right? So whenever you have questions, you go to Max and maybe you have a daily one-on-one meeting with Max. Sometimes it's an ad hoc thing. Sometimes you're just firing questions off in Slack and whenever you get responses. It really depends on the company, but I think that that's one of the most important questions you can ask as a junior developer interviewing is, what does it look like for me as a junior developer in relation to senior developers already in your company, right? Do I get assigned a mentor? How do your senior devs often help your junior developers? What kind of growth path do I have going forward? What happens when I run into questions, right? All of those are great questions to ask in an interview. because we have had careers in code graduates go to companies who are hiring for a junior dev, but are not prepared for a junior dev to be on their team, right? They don't have the mentorship structure set up, and they don't have hours allocated to helping you as a junior dev be able to accomplish your tasks. And at no point as a junior dev should you feel like you don't have a support network, because it takes a couple years of being a junior dev to work your way up to senior, to work your way up to the point where you can complete the task from start to finish without having to ask any questions. And that, to me, is the most important line between junior and senior dev is, hey, as a junior dev, you're going to have questions not only on the onset of having a task assigned to you, you're also going to have questions as you're doing the task. A senior dev, on the other hand, is going to have fewer questions at the beginning of the task and is going to be able to implement the task on their own. Or if questions do come up, they're going to be able to go directly to the person using the software or requesting the feature, instead of having to work through the feature with either their manager or another senior dev on the team. And so that's kind of the delineation between senior and junior, is that junior dev is just going to need to have a couple question sessions with a senior dev, as opposed to a senior dev who is going to have more questions at the onset, but they're going to be able to get answers to all of those questions directly from the person requesting the feature, instead of having to work with another dev to work through those questions. Did that answer your question?
It did. Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
yeah. It gave me some idea of what to expect. And like you said, it varies from company to company. So, but something along those lines.
Absolutely. And something really important to think about coming out of this program is, what do I want to be doing, right? Because there are going to be countless junior developer job openings posted, right? You go on Indeed right now and you search for remote junior software developer or software engineer, you're going to get thousands of results, right? So narrowing that down and saying, okay, what concepts of this curriculum were most important to me? Do I want to be doing full stack work, or do I want to be focusing in on the front end? Because the job descriptions for front-end developer or website designer and developer are going to be very different than junior full stack developer, right? So trying to narrow that in and say, well, do I want to be spending my whole day in HTML, CSS, and front-end JavaScript? Or is the last kind of third or quarter of the program really interesting for working with the database and making API calls and building something full stack and working in multiple components? Because we have a lot of students come out of this program and go, full stack is cool, I survived it, I don't want to be doing that, 40 hours a week. And that's okay. So you may come out of next week and go, actually, SQL is really cool, I want to go do a full boot camp or go through the free code camp and get my SQL certification, because working in the database is where I want to spend my time. And even though that's only 2 weeks of our 24-week program, that's often an outcome of, well, I really like these 2 weeks, and so that's where I want to focus in. So that would be my main piece of advice, is there are kind of two approaches to applying for jobs. One is apply to anything and everything, right? Just go out, submit my resume everywhere, submit my cover letter everywhere, and whoever I hear back from, is what kind of job I want to do. That's one option. The other option is, hey, I'm really going to invest my time into the job search. So instead of just hitting the apply button on any different job description I can find on Indeed or Monster or any of the other job sites, I'm going to narrow it in. I'm going to find a local Syracuse company that I really like. And even though they may not have a job description on their website, I'm going to use LinkedIn to my advantage, and I'm going to find a manager there, right? Someone on the software team. And I'm going to message them and say, hey, I was doing research on your company. I just graduated from a local boot camp. I would love to get to know more about what your team is working on. Don't need to lead with a job description. It is just research for you at this point, right? And now you've got a foot in the door. If they will meet you for a coffee, if they'll do a 30-minute Zoom session with you, and you have to have questions ready, right? Prepared to be a newspaper author or interviewer or a news anchor or whoever you want to consider, right? But like, have your questions ready. Hey, what kind of stack are you using? How is your team structured? What's a day look like for your engineer? What are some challenges that you're facing as an engineering manager? What's your hiring process normally look like? Now you've got a foot in the door. And so that now that you know the person, when that job opening does come up at their company, now all of a sudden, when you apply, you're not just going to be a name in a sea of 300 applicants. You're going to stand out as someone who they have a conversation with. And when your resume comes back, they're going to go, oh, careers in code. I heard about that. And while they're reading your resume and go, oh, Doug, I had a conversation with Doug 2 months ago. Yeah, you know what? I want to definitely, you know, move him to the interview phase. And so that's, I may be, I don't want to say countering, but this definitely gets into Laura's area of expertise in the career coach side. But that has been my my most successful thing in a job search, is getting your foot in the door more than just applying, right? So reaching out to the company, even if you apply to the company, if you get really excited about that company, do your research on them, find the person who's responsible for hiring, try and find someone on the engineering team, just find someone at the company who's willing to talk to you. And try and have a conversation with them, whether it's a Zoom call, whether it's a cup of coffee downtown, whatever it is. That's my biggest advice, is try and stand out. And the best way you're going to stand out is to have a conversation with someone. It's a lot of work, but when interviews go the best for me, and when we have had our best hires, it has always been when someone is excited to work at our company. And whether that is excitement because they want to use the tech stack that we're using, whether that's excitement because they're excited about what they're building, whether that's excitement because they're a junior dev and we tend to mentor our junior devs into senior devs really well, whatever it is, when people are excited to work with us, that is when they are the best hire. Whenever we hire someone and they go, I just want to code, like I just want to get a paycheck for coding, they never end up to be a particularly good hire or a good member of the team. So finding a way to express that to a hiring manager and to an engineering manager is definitely going to get you a great foot in the door at the company. I had my mouse on the mute button and I just did not get there. Sorry. Any other questions I can answer? Christy, welcome. Sorry, I've been ranting for a couple minutes. Do you have any questions?
I just wanted to say that was perfectly said. Like perfectly said.
Yeah, I came in on the good part, I guess. So I do have a question. In the bolt,
Yes.
once you put an answer, so I was doing it and I was putting answers in, and then it seemed, you know how like in free code camp, like you hit like run or whatever in it. So it seems like I'm putting answers in, but then when I'm putting the answers in, it seems like I'm not getting the right result. I think the battery in my mouse is dead. Wait a minute. I'm trying to pull.
So SQL Bolt is a little different than the Khan Academy that we've been using, in that Khan Academy is like write a select statement and then you go on to like step 2 of the challenge. And it's like write a second select statement, right? Where you don't modify the first one. In SQL Bolt, it is the opposite of that. You just keep modifying your query until you get the one that, until you get it. And then they move you automatically onto the next step where you keep modifying that query that you just wrote until you, get the check mark for that particular step. With that said, if you have gotten stuck somewhere where you're like, I can't get over, this problem, I feel free to screen share and we can try and work through it.
No, I know. I feel like I know the answers, but when I put the answer in, so when I put the answer in, the green check mark is just going to automatically pop up there when I have the correct answer.
So I just ran into this. I think in the earlier exercises, they do automatically put the green check marks in. And as I got to the later exercises, I was doing the same thing. I was pulling my hair out. I was like, I swear I have the right answer.
Right.
And then I would even click on solution. I'd be like, I guess I don't get it. And it would give me the solution of what I just wrote. On the later exercises, there's a little run query button at the bottom of where you write your code.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was the only thing, because I like you said, I'm like, I got stuck and I hit the solution, and the solution was the same answer, and I was like, well, why didn't it? But you know what? I probably wasn't paying attention to if a check mark popped up or not. Okay.
Oh, yeah. So let me share my screen just to thank you, Doug, for jumping in there and reminding Christy that she's not always crazy. So on lesson 1, when you're in here, right, and it's like find the title for each film, and you literally just put in title, and now it gives you the check mark, and it says, all right, well, now find the director, and so you just put in director, and it moves you on. However, I just jumped all the way to 18, and there is this here that says let's clean up by removing the movies table, right? So you're going to do a drop table movies, and you're like, well, that should be the solution, but you do have to hit this run query button here, and that's what gives you the check mark.
Oh, okay. Because the only thing you can see reset, and it's real faint in the background in the earlier exercises, and so I was like,
yeah, you need that run query there. And the reason you need to do that is because there is no, once you like drop a table, there is no like undrop table movies, or there is no like undo button, right? Once you run that drop command, there's no undoing it. And that's probably why they moved to this run query button, is like, because what you're doing in the database is a little bit more serious in that you can't just undo it. That's probably why they moved to that run query button. Okay.
So, since we're talking about jobs, so if you were to pursue SQL, what would that look like?
In terms of job descriptions, or in terms of day-to-day job operations?
Both. Okay,
so job descriptions, you're going to be looking for database engineer is kind of the job title that jumps to the top of my head. Database engineer is going to be a master of SQL. It is more common to have junior and senior level software engineers. It is less common to see junior database engineer and senior database engineer, although I'm sure that is a thing. I've read a lot less database engineer job titles than I have full stack software development job titles. So take what I'm saying here with a grain of salt, but a databases engineer's job is probably only going to exist at a larger company, right? So your job as a database engineer would be to set up database servers. It would often be to work in a cloud environment. So that's using AWS or Google Cloud Platform or Microsoft Azure to manage database servers and set up new ones. It would be to design databases, which is what we are going into this upcoming week of creating entity relationship diagrams, making sure that we're using the right data types, making sure that we're not duplicating data in our database. It would be working with the consumers of our data. So working with either backend developers and providing them SQL queries so that they can insert or retrieve data from the database. Or you may be working with a desktop or mobile application team who needs to have that data displayed. Sometimes you would be using some kind of dashboard tool to be able to present the data to the business team in a way that they can actually view the data in the database without having to write the SQL queries themselves directly. You would be responsible for setting up and maintaining database backups, in addition to database security, making sure that only certain users have access to the data, making sure that people can't accidentally execute a query. It would be setting up multiple database environments so that you would have a development environment for your developers. So if they did something wrong in the database and they accidentally dropped the table that they shouldn't have dropped, it's not going to affect production systems where like our actual end users are reading and writing data into that table. Largely, it would be, I mean, the biggest thing as a database engineer, the two biggest overarching things are going to be, first and foremost, you're writing a whole heck of a lot of SQL. Second would be you're going to be doing database design and making sure your data is structured right. And then the third thing would be database administration in terms of setting up new servers, getting them working in the cloud environment, managing connections, and that kind of stuff. So those are kind of the three biggest categories: is SQL, SQL, SQL. It would be database design, and then it would also be database administration, kind of more on the DevOps side. And that's kind of what a database engineer would be doing. Now, if you say, hey, this is kind of interesting, I like SQL, but I like working with data the most. And what I find the most interesting is taking these data sets, like when we played around with that Marvel data set, right? And we were like, oh, show us the most popular Marvel characters. And then we were like, well, show us the most popular women Marvel characters. And then we were like, well, show us whether or not they're, you know, good or bad, or neutral Marvel characters, right? That is kind of bordering on the job title of data scientist, where, hey, you're still going to be working with SQL, but instead of focusing on data design and database administration, instead you're going to be using SQL to kind of get information and insights out of a large data set. And so that's kind of a related field to database engineer, is data scientist, where you're still going to need to use SQL and be comfortable with SQL, but instead of focused on the technical operations of a database, you're going to be focused on the data inside that database.
Okay, yeah, I watched a couple of videos. So now tomorrow, I mean, this week, we're going to learn how to set up a database. So what are we going to be using? Because I was doing some activities on Code Academy, and at one point they wanted me to set up SQLite, but I didn't do it because I was on my Windows computer. So, but So what will we be using? Because it kind of walked me through the steps and it was giving me information. So I was reading it and I was like, oh, okay, so this is what we're gonna be doing next week. So I'm just wondering,
Yep. So we're going to be using a SQL variant called Postgres, Postgres.
I saw that.
Postgres is SQLite is often the most used SQL database for people just getting started with using SQL because it can run in so many places, including the web browser. Which is not very common, right? Normally, your database server is going to run where your backend API server is going to run. So like in an actual terminal in your on your computer. So that's why SQLite is used in so many places, is because it's one of the only databases that works directly in your browser. However, because it is literally light is in the name of it, it is a very lightweight database and it doesn't have all the full features of a typical SQL database. For example, a lot of the joins are not supported in SQLite. And
it said, I read that too, where it said that there was some stuff and then maybe it's a lot slower because there's a lot of people in it. Yeah, I read that.
Yeah. So I mean, there is a time and place for SQLite. I don't want you to think that I am like bad mouthing SQLite.
Right. I read everything you said. I was reading, in the article that I was reading, it was in there. Now, will we be using the Postgres? Will we be able to put that? We're going to use that in VS Code?
Yeah, yes, but not in the way that you think. So
because we're going to have a local host, so that's going to be like a 3300 06 or something.
Yes. So we are going to use a application called Postgres.app, and that is what's going to install and set up and run our Postgres server for us. And that Postgres server is going to run on another port. 3306 sounds familiar, but also so does 5432. So I can't tell you what port it's going to be off the top of my head. But we are going to install and run Postgres app. And that's going to get our SQL server running for us. And then we're going to download and install a tool called Beekeeper Studio. And that's where we're going to start. You can think of Beekeeper Studio as kind of the postman for our SQL. In terms of that's where we can type in our SQL commands, hit the run button, and actually see them execute in our code, right? And we can actually see the results of our select queries or stuff like that. And then once we get over database design and using our database locally, we're going to move into the next phase, which is learning Node.js. Because in order to be able to interact with our database server, we need to know server-side JavaScript. And we've kind of already scratched the surface with Node a little bit with like the calculator we did in the terminal, where we npm the prompts package and ask for 2 numbers and console log something out. So we're going to go a little bit more into Node and a framework called Express. And then once we get Express up and running, we are going to be able to write our SQL directly in our Node code and be able to see the results of that, not only in Postman, but also in Beekeeper, which is where we can actually execute our SQL commands and kind of have a view into the database. So I know I just threw a lot at you there, but to summarize, we're going to use Postgres.app to set up our Postgres server, which will be running on another port. Then we will be using Beekeeper Studio as kind of our development tool to be able to interact with the database directly through our SQL commands. Then we are going to be using Node and a framework called Express to set up our own API server. And
Mhm.
then we're going to be writing our SQL commands directly in our node code, which we'll be editing in VS Code. And then finally, we're going to get to the point where we're building out enough of our API that we can interact with the database in our SQL code through the API that is running in Node that we are editing in VS Code.
Okay. That was a lot, so I have to absorb that. But okay, this is my last question in case Wayne has a question. So I was looking at this, and so it just seems like it's not easy, but it just seems a little bit too easy. So it's just like, it's just manipulation, it's just queries, it's aggregates, it's tables, like, and then there's those certain commands, like that's it, that's SQL.
That
All
is SQL. What is nuts about SQL is that you can take these concepts and end up writing a several hundred line SQL select statement or a SQL script. So SQL can get complicated in its length, but at the end of the day, you have covered all of the concepts. So the only thing that I would kind of, well, not all of the concepts, but the SQL basics, right?
Mhm.
So the only thing I will I don't want to say counter that with, but there is a reason why we only spend 2 weeks on SQL in our curriculum when we've spent, 4 weeks on our JavaScript or 3 weeks on our React or 4 weeks on our HTML, right? So like the reason why we only spend a week here is because that SQL has a lower learning curve, a lower barrier to entry to get chugged up there. So now what the kind of fun part is after we get through database design and setting up a database server locally on our computer, after that, now we get into, okay, well, how do we actually use our SQL outside of this vacuum, right? How can we get our database working in our JavaScript? How can we build out an API? And that's where SQL gets to be a little bit more challenging, because not only are you using SQL, but your SQL has to work in your JavaScript, and your JavaScript has to work with your front end, and your front end has to show the data. So that's really where the challenge with SQL is going to come, is because there are so many pieces in it, getting all of those pieces to work together is really where the engineering challenge lies.
So where we are, like, where we seen in it wasn't JavaScript. We just did it. React, where we saw where we were like, maybe we had a React, we had that JavaScript page where we were writing the ATL. So we're going to bring SQL into that page, like the page we were on where we were bringing
through our fetch request and the API that we're going to build. Yes, SQL will be part of that.
Okay.
So we're going to build you're going to get sick of the chat app really quickly, but the chat app we're going to go back to, and you're going to build your own API for the chat app. And that API needs to store the data somewhere. So we're going to store it in Node to get started. And then we're going to layer in our Postgres, and we're going to say, hey, we need to create some tables. We need to think through our table structure. And then we're going to be writing some SQL in our API, in our Node code, that is going to execute the SQL and return the results back to our React app to make those messages show up.
Oh boy.
And then you get to do it all on your own with no guidance whatsoever in your capstone.
Oh boy. Okay.
This is when one-on-ones normally start picking up. And that's completely fine, but we're gonna get you there. It seems like a lot for the short amount of time that's remaining, but this is the fun part, is we get to go a little bit faster here because it all falls together. SQL is the last new language we're teaching you. JSX is different syntax, SQL is different syntax, JavaScript, HTML is separate syntax, but that's it. There's no more syntax coming your way. So now it's a matter of using the JavaScript you already know to build your API. Now it's a matter of using the JSX that you learned in the React to format your data to show up in your front end. Now it's a matter of writing your SQL statements in your node code in order to get the data out from the database or into the database. And so that's kind of where we're headed, is now we just get to take all of these different languages and syntaxes and puzzle pieces that we've been, drip feeding to you, and now we start to use them all together.
Okay. Yeah, SQL seems to have been a little less, a little easier, I would say, than like JavaScript. So I was just wondering how it was gonna go
Don't
forward.
get used to it.
I know, right? I don't, well, look, I'll give somebody else a turn. Wayne.
Wayne, any questions?
I'm just listening. Sorry.
Nope, no problem.
Mm. I just wanted to make sure I check in because I was kind of cooking, but I still wanted to be present for office hours.
No problem. And Doug and Nicole had some good questions at the beginning of the session too. So I will make sure to post this recording in case you guys want to catch up on that first half.
Yeah, definitely would. I always like to hear your guys' questions. No offense.
Awesome. Any other questions from anyone?
No, now that I know I was doing the right thing and I need to pay attention to the green check mark, I can go back to my homework and finish it. It was like thinking that I was doing something wrong.
No, that's it. I'm glad Doug mentioned that because I had done the first couple lessons in SQL Bolt, but I didn't finish them out. I reviewed all of them to make sure they were all worthwhile before I assigned that, but I didn't know about that run query button. So
Yeah, I ran into that very same problem earlier today.
I'm glad y'all showed it, because I probably would have ran into it too, and it would have prolonged my I'm glad.
Oh, I have a question. So I noticed in SQL that there like that not operator with like the parentheses and the equal sign. So is that like I can't remember, but I'm just wondering, is that like a standard?
yeah, so there
less than equals to and all of that stuff, but that.
Yeah, so it depends on the SQL variant that you're in. That not syntax was probably the initial not operator in SQL, but because so many programming languages use exclamation point equal to be not equal, most SQL variants have now started supporting that. So you can use the exclamation equal instead of the specific not equal to operator in SQL, and they should behave exactly the same.
Oh, okay. I'm just trying to make things all be the same. Universal. I want them to be universal. So once you start to remember them, it will mean the same thing no matter where you're putting it.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, you can do not equal as exclamation point equal, just like it is in JavaScript, and that should work as well.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I will drop a link in the chat for the differences in the syntax if you really want to read into it. But the general answer is that most databases now support either as the exact same operator.
Oh, okay.
And I'm going to modify the assignment in Canvas to say note on the later lessons, you need to hit the run query button next to reset in order to get the green check marks to test and complete a lesson. Not sure that many people will see that, but if they're in Canvas going crazy, at least they will be able to have that note.
All righty.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Max.
No problem. Last chance for any questions.
I have one question. When Christy said SQL seems a little easier so far than JavaScript, and you said don't get used to it, did that mean that SQL is going to start getting more complicated, or just everything in general?
Everything in general. We're off from our JavaScript just for next week, and then everything kind of gets a bit more complicated. So if you thought that you had a lot of windows up during class normally, wait until next week, wait until the full stack stuff, because now we get into the point of we need our front end code open in React, and React has to be running a server in order for us to be able to test it. Then we need our VS Code open for our React code. Then we need VS Code open in another window for our backend code. Then we need a terminal window running our backend server. And then we also need to have our database server running in the background. And then we need to have Beekeeper open so we can actually test in the database and see the data there. We might also need to have Postman open to be able to test our backend and make sure our API is working as anticipated. And then on top of all of that, I'm going to be sharing my screen, and I have my own copy of all of those windows open as well. And so that is where the complexity picks up a little bit, and why I said don't get used to it, because the most important thing, and I'm going to stress this once we get not this upcoming week, but the following weeks, of like, this may be a time where instead of taking a break after every 10 minutes of me doing something, instead I'm going to do it over a 30-minute period and then take a break and have all of the steps written out for you guys to go try it on your own. Because there are going to be so many windows to juggle that once we get to this point, and the good news is this is certainly not the first time I have taught this content, but there are so many different places it can go wrong that it gets to be at the point in class where you're saying, let me make sure that I'm writing down these steps as Max is doing it, because when something does go wrong at one of those steps, I need to know what tool I need to use to test to see where it's going wrong, right? Okay, we sent a message in the chat app, and that message needs to go into our fetch request. Our fetch request needs to make it to the back end. The back end needs to make sure that we're getting the data there right. Then we need to make sure that we're inserting that message into the database. Then we need to make sure the database is showing that data in there. Then we need to make sure that we're getting the data back out of the database. Then we need to make sure that that data is making it back to the front end. And then our front end needs to actually show that data. So obviously that is a lot of steps. That is not going to be something that I do in 3 minutes, right? We go step by step and make sure everything is working along that chain. But if you're trying to keep up in class and your data isn't getting sent from the front end to the back end properly, well, then you're certainly not going to be able to get it into the database, and the database isn't going to be able to select the data out properly. And then you're not going to be able to get that data to show up properly in your front end either, right? And so that's why we focus on the steps and say, okay, let's identify. We can't just say it's not working. We need to go step by step to make sure it's working at each one of those steps before we move on to the next one. But with that said, I don't want you to panic, because we haven't done intro to Node yet. We haven't done any of our database design yet. And so we're going to work our way up to that. And we've got 2 full weeks of class before we get into full stack of making every one of those steps work.
I'm panicking anyhow.
Full stack development, I think, is the most fun, right? I wouldn't, I have had job offers in the past of, hey, you know React well enough, do you want to be a React developer? Or, hey, you know Node enough, do you want to be a backend developer? And I'm like, nope. The full stack is the most fun for me, right? Because when someone comes to me and says, hey, I've got an idea for an app, that means I can build that app from start to finish, right? I don't need to pull in someone who knows databases. I don't need to pull in a front end expert other than maybe a designer. Right. I can make that app. It might not be pretty. There may be some efficiencies that could be improved upon. But when someone comes to me with an idea, I can say I can do a database, I can make you an API, and I can set up a front end to show all of that data. And that's why it's the most fun for me, because now we get to the point where you can say, I really can build any idea that someone comes to me with.
Yeah, that was too much. That was too much. You made my brain hurt. So.
Don't worry, we'll work our way up to that in the next 2 weeks. We won't dump it all on you all at once.
Okay. Well,
It does sound very cool.
it does sound cool, but it does sound like a lot. Like my brain was like,
Yeah.
what? My brain was like,
It does sound really cool. I know
Awesome. Well, I will let you guys go. Have an awesome part of what's left of your weekend, and I will see you all on Monday.
All right, good night, Max. Feel better.
Thanks. The cough sounds terrible, but like it's the only thing that's left. I feel fine. It's just this annoying cough that I can't shake.
It seems like it keeps lingering.
Yeah. I'll shake it eventually.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you guys. I'll see ya.
Good night.